have to transcribe.
Oh, I'm enormously talented at that.
Because
It's the one thing I do well.
wait for-
This is Robert L. Greene, and this is a oral history on Gene Allen. That's Geneallen. I'm going to just read some biographical information. It's very brief, but enough so that you have a first page to indicate the level and the quality of Mr. Allen. This is for the Resource Center Archives. Mr. Allen is a three-time Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Art Director, Production Designer nominee. The nominations were for the Judy Garland James Mason picture A Star is Born, MGM's Les Girls, and Warner Brothers' My Fair Lady. Parenthesis for which Mr. Allen won an Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Oscar. He is also the immediate past president of the Academy, having served 2 terms as president. Prior to that, he served 4 years as treasurer and is currently vice president. He is a member of both the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild of America. His career in the movies went from Warner Brothers, Blueprint Boy, producer, designer, director, writer for George Cukor's film company, GDC Pictures Incorporated. That's enough of that. Gene Allen, will you just simply start by telling me who you are, where you came from, parents, education, that sort of thing?
Well, that can be very short because formal education was limited to graduating from high school. I left Fairfax High School in the city of Los Angeles, went to half a term at Santa Monica City College to play a little football, found out that wasn't my talent, and through a series of strange circumstances ended up being a blueprint boy at Warner Brothers Art Department.
What was that?
What was it, or when was it?
Well, no, what was it? I mean,
that's a job. The departments in those days were huge departments. It was like a architectural office, and all of these designers were working from the art directors were working down through what they then called draftsmen, and all of these drawings would have to be printed to be put into work, to be the sets to be made. They had to go somewhere. Somebody had to do this, and they had the old-fashioned blueprint method then, and so later on they became black and white. You never see a blueprint anymore. It's always black and white. That was just a job. I was sent around the lot and to be a messenger boy, and nobody wanted me. I ended up on the lot with my father, who was a police captain in the Los Angeles Police Department, had done a favor for Bert Tuttle at that time. Bert Teitelbaum at that time, later became Bert Tuttle. But I think kept him out of jail. He had about 527 speeding tickets. And somehow Bert Teitelbaum knew about my dad because they had done a story at Warner Brothers on my dad's life as inventing the Bureau of Missing Persons. And he was the one that had found this sort of thing that was a part of the city program and wasn't involved with criminal activities, which he loved to get away from. And so he's developed this Bureau of Missing Persons, which later on Pat O'Brien played my father in a picture at Warner Brothers. So through that strange connection, here's a young boy looking for a job.
Mr. Teitelbaum was with Warner's.
Was with Warner's. He was head of the art department. And had then, because of that previous connection, my dad had helped him with some tickets or something. So when he sent me there, it was an annoyance to him, you could see, and he sent me over to see this department and that, and I went to about 10 departments. Ended up in the one I really wanted to be in, is the art department. In high school, I drew and painted and that sort of thing, so it's really where I wanted to be. And so it all works out. That's, people say, how do you get your big break in movies? Well, it's strange if your dad happened to fix tickets for the guy that was the head of the department. Maybe that's how you get your start. But so that's how I got into it, and then I immediately did my job as a blueprint boy, but stayed a lot of the time in the illustrators department where the sketch artists were working.
Now, what was their responsibility?
They worked, again, the top man would be in the art director. They were the men that would do all of the three-dimensional drawings, set sketches that you're familiar with, the thing where you'd see the full set with all the dressing in it, the lighting effects, and all those are the fellows that did that. They're very much like magazine illustrators, where you illustrate a story, they'd be given particular scenes and would illustrate it. So I started fooling around with them and going to night school and local schools here at Chenard Art Institute. And that was really what I wanted to do.
Can you track for me? Because I think that people who might use this information for research, what somebody writes a script, it's cast. Then how does it get to the art department?
Well, in those days, you know, that we had the big departments, so everything would be sent to, the script would be sent when it was approved to all the different people. One of those very early on the list is the art department, because somebody has to start thinking right away, breaking down the script in the sense of what are going to be locations, what sets do we have to build, and of course in those days you built many more sets. You didn't go out as much as you do today. The equipment was heavier, the film was slower, and they wanted to keep their stars on the lot so they could control them. There are many reasons why we had the big studios developed here. And but that would come into the head of the art department. He would assign it to one of the unit art directors that were on staff. Warner's had us 10 or 12 marvelous, brilliant art directors at that time. They would take the script, break it down in the way that I suggested, the locations not. They would start working with the decorator, maybe, and that person would start thinking of that. The cameraman would be assigned. The art director would start working with the cameraman on what kind of lighting were they going to do in the sets. And then he would have key scenes illustrated. They might make three-dimensional little models in the model room, or they might make sketches or do both on the scenes.
Supposing a script simply said, Joan Crawford movie, Working Girl's Apartment, what is the process of deciding what kind of a working girl's apartment?
Well, again, then you have to, the art director reads the script, makes a lot of determinations of what the writer has implied that person is, what status, what is the storyline, and makes up their own little script insofar as the art direction is concerned.
Yes.
That you start making all these little notes, and if somewhere in there it indicated that she not only was a businesswoman, but that she went to Africa and hunted. Well, obviously, you know, as a decorator, those are the keys you look for, and the apartment would suddenly be something different than just an apartment somewhere. You start to individualize the settings for the story.
You know, when you decorate under ordinary circumstances, you work within a budget. How did this operate in terms of the studio?
Same way. They're very, very strict. They had production departments and budgets. That was one of the first things the art director had to do would be to come up with a budget, and that's where I said he worked early with the decorator. The decorator would go off and look at it, come back to the art director with what he thought that he was going to need to decorate that picture. They'd combine all of that, then it would go to the electrical department, and they would say how much scaffolding they had to have. So finally there would be a total budget for that picture. Then you'd get to go ahead, or you'd say, no, you have to go cut down, which is most of the time. So then you go back through all those departments and tell them to take out another 10%. So then you start reducing your scope.
Did you have, for instance, you kept furniture in storage?
Yes, they had tremendous
supplies that you could draw upon?
Tremendous. I just read a silly article yesterday that Canon Productions bought Elstree in London. And the man said, hi, I've got a brilliant idea. We're going to keep all of our props and establish a prop department. And the article said, and that's the first time that's ever been done in this business. Well, as far back as I can remember, we've had huge buildings with props. And Warner's, all of them did. They went over to Europe and bought for future pictures that they never even knew would be made or not. They bought, you know, at sales and these things and built up a marvelous property department. And then the decorators worked with the art directors through that, out of that thing. And then whatever else they had to get, they'd purchase or rent on the side.
How did you develop the career? In other words, you started as a
yes, and then as I say, I got interested in the sketch artists, the illustrators, and went to night school, and then one of the C art directors. In those days, they had A, B, and C pictures. And so the C art director usually never had a budget that would afford an illustrator.
Was the determination in terms of the hierarchy just money?
Yes, sure.
Were you able to progress from being a CBA, or could you go from C to A?
Oh yeah, it could, but the reason I said I got my first sketch to do because he had no money in for an illustrator, and I was always around asking any of them, look, I'll do sketches at night, it doesn't make any difference, or I'll come in, well, we work Saturdays anyway, I'll come in Sunday. But I was always trying to promote, give me a sketch to do, just something, and I'll do it. So a very nice gentleman Charles Novi, if I remember the name correctly. Gave me a little sketch to do, a little apartment stairway sort of thing, and that was my first sketch. So that's how you do it, and and then I was studying art. But interesting enough, I developed, and then I became a sketch artist, apprentice sketch artist, and but there were plenty of things and times where the movie business has always been too much or not enough.
Feast or famine.
And I got married, and we decided, and maybe it was because my father was a civil servant, and the check came in every month, all during the Depression. I never knew the difference, whether it was a depression or not. Everything stayed the same at our house. Never too much, but never starving. And suddenly, you'd not work for 6 months or 3 months or 2 months, depending on the programs, and you'd always get laid off about a month or two before Christmas. And then they'd say, well, call the first of the year, and you'd start calling, and then tax time then was March 15th, not April 15th. Then they'd say, well, after tax time, we'll be able to get back in production. So there was a long period in there. So I took an examination for the Los Angeles Police Department and passed very high on the list. And then, the next thing I know, I'm going through police academy as a police officer. And I did 6 months and 1 day, enlisted in the Navy. World War II came along and saved me. I then went in the Navy for 3.5 years, whatever it was, almost 4. Then came out, and
Did you use your talents in the Navy? Did they use your talents?
well, as a policeman, which it's funny because I had 6 months, right?
Yeah, perfect.
But I got into intelligence work and investigation work, and again, a strange coincidence. I get a call. I'm working on landing craft, all ready to go overseas in the landing division, small boat division. And I get a call and a report to a Commander Evans, and this is on the San Diego base, and I go down. And a little shaky, first time to talk to an officer about anything. I had no idea what I'd done wrong. And he said,
Irish guilt.
Yeah, he says, is your dad Butch Allen? And I said, well, yes. He said, well, I'm Lieutenant Evans of the Los Angeles Police Department. In the Navy now as a lieutenant commander. So he said, I'm going to put you start a base investigation office. I want you in it. So, things like that happen. It's weird how that all happened. The main thing was I did the time, came out, and had built up that time. I couldn't afford it. Really stop work and go to full-time art school, but on the GI Bill I did. I was married and had a son, but nevertheless the GI Bill. So now I really went to school and studied, knowing what I wanted to do in the movie business. So about 3.5 years of that.
Where did you go?
I went to Chenard, but then I started teaching classes at the same school, and that was always strange if you know how a school would be. You're sitting as a student with somebody 1 minute, in the next room you go in and you're the teacher. So then I transferred over to Jepson Art Institute, a very good institute, and continued teaching at Chenard.
Did they have programs that were designed in terms of the professional training of people for the film industry?
No, not really. There was 1 or 2 schools out around, sort of little groups of guys, illustrators or something might have a little school because the government helped you get started. But basically not. But I knew what you needed to do. You really didn't want to study motion picture work. You wanted to study fine art, color, composition. So I worked with Rico LeBrun, Howard Warshaw, and some great artists. That you learn concepts, and then you can always adapt it, which is what I found was always the best thing to do. And, for instance, just in designing a set, if you're going to design a Western street, you don't get all the old Western streets and look at them. What I would do is find out, well, who were the builders that went west, that built these streets? Who designed them? Who did that sort of thing? You'd find out, well, they really came out of Detroit, and they were copying in wood what they'd done in brick in New York or New Jersey or somewhere. So I would always get that same period of type of architecture out of those bigger cities, then adapt it as they did to whatever the conditions were. So that I did one big street in New Mexico, Western Street. I was the only one I ever really got to do a whole street. Most of the time you just change a little bit of something. But I use that concept, and it's kind of fun. And I think that is the way to go, and I think most good art directors do that. You don't just copy, although I guess in costumes they did. Once they started in Western costumes, everybody used that from then on, whether it was the right kind or not. It had a look, and that's what everybody wanted to see.
How, well, one of the things that, of course, in the area of design that one always recognizes is that the movies were larger than life. I mean, I've always established for students that the difference between film and television is that film dealt with the extraordinary and television deals with the ordinary.
Yeah, very good.
And the whole larger-than-life quality manifested itself certainly in the world of fashion. There were fashion designs assigned to periods that had nothing to do with the period whatsoever. Like MGM Medieval,
Yeah.
That kind
Right.
of thing. Did that apply in terms of set design
Yes,
as
it really
well?
did. Cedric Gibbons is a name you hear, and is the right name, and he was sort of invented white on white. And I had a good friend, George Une, I worked with, who was a famous photographer, and he called that Minnie the Eighth architecture, all of that strange, white, bigger-than-life architecture. But it was a style, it was established, and it influenced design with other people, nightclubs, whatever, outside of the movie business. But you did do that. You took, I worked with Warner's with the famous Anton Groth, a German designer, art director. And he always twisted everything. He never had a square room. There was always a little odd shape, and the roofs came down, and it came from Dr. Caligari's cabinet or something, that kind of designing. And
Almost surrealistic.
yeah, and yet reduced back to the normal, back to this real.
Mm-hmm.
And with a camera, you could never tell. So, would you mind telling them that I'm in the middle of a conversation unless it's terribly important? I'm sorry to do that, but if you want to keep this going, or we
Yes,
can
I
shut
do.
it for a minute.
No. Well, if you have to
If
take
it's,
the
yeah,
call,
if it has to be God or something.
Do we have to stop? No, not that important. Okay. It's not God. We're talking about Dr. Caligari.
Right, and so I learned, I used it as on Lay Girls. One of the reasons it was probably nominated was some of those kind of theories. I put a dot on a piece of paper, and that was the camera. And then no matter whether the camera moved 2 inches, I wanted a beautiful vista, and I wanted a beautiful this, no matter what it did, until it turned around, reasonably amount around, so that there was always something. And then I designed everything from that point. And then you really don't know as an audience whether the rooms are square or not. And so that concept from Anton Groth I used in movies. And, again, also in those days, black and white photography, they actually painted shadows. They enlarged moldings. They did, it's like women do with their eyes to make them better than they really are. That exaggeration that you were talking about, a little bigger than life. If you do that all, it adds up on the total thing. So that's why you wonder, when you see now, they do very realistic looking pictures, but it doesn't have that little added dimension because they can't make the moldings bigger on an actual location. So we're skipping around a bit, but that's
all right.
That's part of designing. That's what you learn to do, and of course.
What were some of the other tricks that they did? Whether you did them or others observed them.
Well, the whole thing was to fool the eye. I remember at Warner's when they were doing the Errol Flynn pirate period pieces on those, the terribly complicated method of having this big ship on the sea with the rockers, with the wave patterns in the back, which was cellophane with a fan blowing them, changing the horizon when the camera, so that things worked and became realistic, and the train station where the trains were in there but didn't go, but all the things they did. It was a whole magic world that was built around the studios. That's all kind of gone now, but that concept, the art director had to be terribly inventive.
What did you know about camera angling? With so much of what the eye sees is not what the camera sees. The camera sees everything.
Yeah,
So
but you really learn to do that, and as an illustrator, you learn to project, and probably the true answer to it is just by observation, that you see movies and you see the real thing, and then you're on the stages and you're working as apprentices, or the Blueprint Boy I watched as an illustrator. You go down and watch, and they look over the shoulder of an art director, and then you see the sets, and then you see the movies, and you know what you would do if you had the chance. And you do a great deal of exaggeration, and we did forced perspectives. If we really didn't have the depth of a stage, as long as the camera would stay stationary, you could reduce. tipped the ceilings a little more, made it look longer, and then brought in the walls. It gave you these looks. I always thought that it would be interesting to do in some of the hotels and things that they're doing in new ways, that if you could confine the pedestrians to being in certain areas, you could do much more than just building full realistic backgrounds.
That's quite true.
You could do great things in less space.
You mentioned fool the eye. How much trompe-l'oeil was actually used in set design?
Quite a bit, of course. You know, when you did every time you did a backing, you in a sense did that. You would have the floor go so far, then the rest of the hallway was a backing, and you'd always try to have some reason for the interruption. But you did a great deal of that, and then the thing known as process shots. That's the back projection where the camera shoots through a screen, and we're over on this end shooting back that way. And what we see on there, in a sense, that's fooling the eye by bringing everything in one flat plane, but making it appear that it isn't. And
Gene, can you go back a bit now? We've taken you from Blue Boy to the police department, to World War II, to coming out. How did you get back
and then I
into
came
the-
back in. Came back in as an illustrator for a film. And
Remember the film?
Remember the film was
And what year are we talking about?
well, it was war over 40,
45.
45, 40. So this would be 46 or 47, 48. It'd be about 49 now. I allowed for
Right.
school in there. And so I came out, and I don't remember, something for,
What studio?
it was an independent,
Was it
one
difficult?
of the World
to,
War II pictures.
Was it difficult to get back into
John
it, or
Wayne.
did they respect the fact that you'd been away? Or?
No, they didn't really care or know, or, you know, the studio was very cold, I think. There was a few of my friends still around, but it was, you know, once I got back, I worked reasonably steady after that. As a sketch artist, and I went over and did a stint at 20th Century Fox as a sketch artist, worked on Betty Grable pictures, all that kind of stuff that was going on at that time. And then again, if things were slowed down, you'd be off and you'd be on. So I was laid off at 20th Century Fox. And they said, you know, you're laid off. And I said, no, do I come to work Monday? And they said, no. Then I said, well, then I'm fired. I don't know why I suddenly took this big notion that that's, you know, this business, and no, you're not going to work for us, but we own you. You know, that sort of feeling. Call us every so often. And we all did that, but I suddenly made it up on my mind. I'm not going to sit at home waiting for
Good
Fox
for
to
you.
call me back. So I went over to an interview. There was a picture at Warner Brothers going to be made called A Star is Born. And they brought out George Cukor as a director who I never heard of, hardly, you know, maybe I knew who he was or something, but I'd never met him or anything. I never really worked with directors at all. You had these little compartments, and the art director was God. And they came in and they gave you the script, and you did the sketches, and then they took the sketches and they took them to the director, and they didn't want you to sign the sketches, so if it was necessary they could make believe they did it, because the director wouldn't want to think that the art director wasn't doing all this stuff. You know that down
Sure
the line, it's
do.
a behind the scenes story. But anyway, I just made a point of that, and I went over and got an interview. They just hired an illustrator for the picture, but Lem Ayres happened to like the work I showed him, and I think let the other illustrator go, and I stayed on. Then the story is, I heard George Cukor kept telling him, Lem, you don't know anything about making movies. You're a stage designer. You don't
Came out of
know-
Broadway.
Came out of Broadway, and you really don't understand movies. When he would talk to him about movies, he'd go, Lem, just say, no, I'll do this set and decorate it a certain way, but Cukor, as it turned out, I got to know him very well, is much more involved than that. So I said, why don't you bring somebody down to our morning meetings that know something about the movie business? So Lem Ayres went back, and he said, would you come with me to a meeting? And I said, sure. And then, like everything else, you know, you're always ready when the time comes. If you're smart, you're prepared or something. And I got very interested in writing, and I decided that I didn't want to be a art director. I was going to skip that and go to directing, so that you had to know, to be a director, you had to know really something about writing and directing. So I'd been studying at Fox and at home, and thinking about all these things. So when I read A Star is Born, I read one version, and then they came along with some blue pages and took out this scene and took that out. So the first meeting, when the meeting was over, I said, could I say something that just happened in the script? And that doesn't make sense. They talk about, we're going to have the biggest wedding that's ever been. When Judy Garland and James comes into Charles Bickford, as it turns out, and says, we're going to have this great wedding, big thing. Then the next scene you cut to a little scene in the jail, and a justice of peace is marrying him. Well, they said, we're going to have this great big wedding, and then they cut and they completely missed that scene and went on to something else. So I just pointed out that was such a great transition. Why did you throw it out? Cukor looked like to Lem like, who's this kid? I thought, oh God. I went back up to my thing. That afternoon, some blue pages came back and the scene was back in. So I think that attracted Cukor's attention. And Lem was not well. He had troubles and all. So from that picture, I went from sketch artist to assistant art director to art director to production designer before the picture was over.
I was going to say, but track it. Can you track it in terms of how it happened?
Yeah, well, it was mainly that. And then Cukor suddenly wanted me around a great deal. And then I had only been an illustrator, so we had another art director was on, but he was sort of doing the errands in a sense, or going off and seeing that what I talked with Cukor about would be drawn up, because I'd never done that part of art directing before. And he was a great friend and a nice man, and he did that very well, and so it was a terribly complicated picture, but I more or less became spokesperson with George Cukor.
Was this an individual one-on-one kind of thing?
Yes.
With that director?
By
Does
then,
that happen often?
Not very often. And fact is, the first time that prior to this meeting, Cukor had come through the art department, and Earl Bellamy was the assistant, who later became the director. And he said, oh, by the way, this is Gene Allen, an illustrator. And Cukor did one of his big takes. My God, I get to see an illustrator. He says, Cedric Gibbons would cut my head off if he knew I was meeting people, in an art department. And he made that big scene, made me feel good, and made this thing. So then the next time when he brought him down, when I came down to the meeting, I had, in fact, met him once before that way. But Cukor was then one that you can't, he's just looking for ideas from anybody and everybody. And which interesting thing about that story is I was a fine art painter, and I've been painting, and I'm a good colorist, and I've been working. That was George Cukor's first color picture. He had had a complete career, from Camille with Garbo through all of those, Pat and Mike and all of those pictures.
Well, he was considered the great woman's director.
He was, and he'd done that whole thing, but never once in color. So Stars Born was a big challenge to him. Then we got caught up right away in one of the most complicated things that could happen to you design-wise, was they went from the marvelous 3x4 proportion in Technicolor, which was a perfected color. So we were in great shape. They went to CinemaScope and the new Eastman color process, which was just stamping the color on. And that was such a blow, and every day there was a crisis. The colors are bad, the shots are bad. You couldn't do this, you got to line your actors up. It's out of there was every problem. So as a designer, it really gave me a great challenge, but also gave me a chance to sort of impress people with.
Who was promoting you?
Nobody.
You were promoting yourself?
Nobody. Cukor decided, I think he knows what he's talking about. As I say, from that first experience. And I never talked to George Cukor, and I now work for him from that point for 18 years. A very, very professional relationship with him.
I knew George. He was one of the most articulate people that I've ever known, and certainly a great raconteur. And he did have interests that were much broader than most professional
He would
people.
make believe he didn't know anything about architecture, but he could tell you every architect of importance in the world, and who their wife was, and Aunt Mel. He loved the social side of all of that. And he would do the same thing with cameramen and with this and that. He had this mind that was like you just pour this information in. And I think that the definition of genius is that ability to recall. He could tell you on page 7 of a certain book, the third paragraph. And it was sad at the end to see, I would talk to him about some of the things we'd done. He said, did we really do that? It was gone. But he had that marvelous ability. But he really knew far more than he did. But he let anybody talk. He would let the grips come up and say, wouldn't it be great if Judy Holliday took the earring off while the guy's nibbling her ear? She says, no, I don't want you to. But by taking it off means it does. Cukor said, "That's terrific." And he did that on front of everybody. There are directors who will take all kinds of advice in the dressing room or at the house, but once they're on that stage, stay away from them. George Cukor was just the opposite. He didn't care where great ideas came.
Was
And
he
he
an
always,
exception?
he was an exception. But he always said, as long as I have the right to hire or fire those people, I know who's boss.
It's so interesting that you say that, Gene. Every really brilliant, talented, creative person I have been associated with that had real quality was a person who was capable of giving credit, delegating authority, because they had the security of knowing that the overall look of what was going to be produced had to come out of their particular genius. And they were not threatened by the fact that other people made contributions to it.
That's the whole story. Early on Star is Born, by night being there, Cukor would say, look in the camera and see if the composition is good. Well, that's never done. That's the cameraman and the operator's thing. So now I had to use the Irish to be nice with the cameraman first, something. He said, do you mind? And then pretty soon they're inviting you over because you're no challenge to them. You're giving them good ideas or whatever it is.
You're no threat to them.
No threat. They if you do it right, you can. If you're sort of lording it over them, but you do it quietly and all, not interfere with their egos. But very early, the unit production manager said, I don't like that. He said, Gene, I want you to go back up and do your sketches up in the art department. I said, fine. I said, should I tell Cukor? He said, certainly. So I went over and I said, Eric just mentioned that he would rather I went out on the stage anymore, that I was going to do the sketches for you up in the art department. He said, okay. He said, Eric, and took him behind the set, came back out, and Eric says, no, I think you better stay here, Gene. It was okay. Cukor told me, Eric takes him back there and says, George, don't you realize this man is a threat to you? That, it looks bad for you. And that's where Cukor said, well, for Christ's sake, I'm George Cukor. What the hell? A sketch artist is going to make me look bad? That was never a threat to him. And they, like you say, the good ones can do that. The ones that have a little, they're worrying about it. I know a lot of my friend illustrators spent their whole time in dressing rooms with directors, doing all the continuity sketches and doing all this stuff. But that doesn't work. I found out I would do as Cukor would say, well, let's go back a little bit. We would shoot the day's scene, and then that night we would walk through the next day's scene, so he was starting to get the feel where the sets are, where the doors are. Where do I think the camera should? The cameraman's not there, just George Cukor and myself. And we'd play the actors and actresses, and then the camera would be there, and whatever it is, and we'd work that all out that night. So he said, draw that up. So in the beginning, I used to call home, and I'd sketch up all of those, come in that doors over here, cross over, sit down, we'd get up, and move, all that sort of thing. We'd come in, and the next morning, and George Cukor was like, he went home at night, took his brain out, and washed it out in alcohol, so it would be clean and fresh the next day. And he'd come in the next morning as though we had never rehearsed anything. And he might think of that, and he said, no, I think that if they came in that door and went over this one, well, now you can throw out a whole set of continuities because everything is based on right to lefts and lefts to right.
Can you
and all
define
reverse
continuity? You're totally familiar with it because
Right.
it's part of your profession.
It's like a comic book, like a good illustrated comic book. It illustrates a script.
So you're talking about storyboards.
Storyboard. And that's, in fact, is funny. The script supervisor here in England is known as a continuity. But it's that person that, that what is the story in that sense of what follows what and how do you do it. And, you got to keep your directions right, the rights, the lefts.
It's essentially the director's tool.
It's a tool for, once you all agree on it, if you've got this storyboard and these things, and you put them in little books and all, the cameraman can look and see what it is, what angles you've decided on, the whole thing. But we never got quite that far of what we did an awful lot of it. But in the beginning, I used to draw up these scenes really in great detail and everything. And then one word the next morning, by reversing the situation, you throw out that whole 4 hours work that night. So Cukor would say, go home, and, not to go home, he'd say, draw that up, and I'd say, okay. And then I'd make a couple of little things in the script, and that's all. And then the next day, and he never really needed it, because I always had it in my head. So that was good enough for him. He was always amazed that I could remember.
How detailed were they?
They were not detailed. You get going, you get circles for heads with arrows.
Right.
you don't even draw the nose in so they know the front of the face. But, you know, you're looking that way, you're looking that way. The guys in the white hats are chasing the guys in black, so you know, all that sort of thing. But when I told you back, jumping back again, when I said I was at Fox as an illustrator and decided not to be a art director, I want to be a director, I went to a director and I said, what is it you want from illustrators as a director? I know when these guys do all these sketches, my God, you're a director. You don't want to know in the middle of the scenes that she's looking at him, he's looking at her, this is over the shoulder. I said, all of that stuff, I mean, you're going to do that. What is it you really look with that stuff? Because I only worked through the art director to a director. I never went that the hell the director went. The man's name was Harry Horner, who, by coincidence, and I didn't know at the time, had worked as a production designer for George Cukor on some of his previous pictures. And, you know, life is that small, it's sort of grouped together. Anyway, Harry said, and he doesn't remember this conversation at all, but Harry said, what the directors really want to know is how do you get into a scene and how do you get out of a scene? The script says, you end up in this apartment and you do that or something, and then fade out, fade in, you're over here. Well, what is a fade out and fade in pictorially on the screen? What are you going to do? Are you going to really go to black or you're not? Or do you go, you know, somehow get over on a piece of white, and then you pick up a piece of white on the next set, and you go up to here, and it flows and all that sort of visual things. Or if somebody is going to be shot, it says that the gun went off and he was shot in the stomach. Well, that's so fast in a scene. What can you do? Can a man be pouring himself a glass of milk, and when the shot goes off, the bullet goes through the milk and there's a spatter, you can slow it down, you can do these things. Those are what directors are looking for, he told me. So that from then on, even as a sketch artist, I did a lot more. So when I went over to Cukor, you'll remember how I attracted his attention was getting out of one scene and into the next. Well, it relates to that little episode. And I tell that every class, I go to every student, I can't impress them enough, and I'll tell them, give me 50 ways that somebody can be doing something.
Being prepared for this.
Well, but even on the little thing about being a milk carton and shooting through it, what other devices can you think of? That's what a director wants. So if you're around him as an art director and all, contribute, add those things. Don't just let the script come through. I taught a series of seminars. I had a series of seminars on the script, the Bible it isn't.
Oh, I wish I'd been able to. Are you
We
going to do
did.
that again?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think I will. It's about time. I took, and the next time I call it the Magnificent Seven. I got 7 good production designers and had them each talk one night on how they approached all of these things. And so little is known about this profession of a production designer, and the reason you don't know much about it because you're stepping on the toes of everybody. I'm a member of the Writers Guild because I had never studied writing in my life. I you know, if you can tell stories, I guess you can start being a writer. But Cukor would say, "Oh, that's a good idea. Write it down." You know, so then you sit at the typewriter, and now you're rewriting scenes illegally. You know, the writers who died. It got so bad on one picture, I think it was called the Chapman Report, which I finally ended up writing the screenplay out of a series of things because nobody was getting what Cukor wanted. The picture was going to fold at Warner Brothers. Dick Sanek said, "Geez, Gene, what's going on? Cukor won't accept any of that stuff." I said, "Well, because it's no good." He said, "Do you know what he wants?" I said, "Yeah, I know what he wants." He said, "Well, I went home, wrote 40 pages that weekend, came back, and he said, I like him. What should I do?" And I said, "Get Cukor to agree." Cukor read him, he liked him. So now I was the production designer and the writer for that whole rest. So
Who was in the Chapman Report?
Oh, Jane
Shelley
Fonda,
Winters?
Shelley Winters, that whole thing. It was the first, it was sort of,
Sexual
I'll never forget, well, it was
Diane.
really the opening of
Cannon
sexual.
was in it? Diane Cannon?
No, she was
No,
not,
no, she
no. But what was funny about that picture was that
Kinsey and-
I remember, yeah, it was the Kinsey Report. And it was really bold at that time. And I remember Dick Zanuck showed me that when he sent it into the censor for the thing, it came back and it said, "You're kidding."
Standards of
That was the only
practice
comment.
has gone crazy.
We don't, you can't say that. How often do you have sex? Well, Saturday is once a week, so I have it once a week. That kind of, was that sort of joking dialogue. But that had never really been openly, frankly discussed on the thing. And Cukor, with his good taste and everything, and Jane Fonda looked to her that was the hardest part to write for. That, you know, a frigid woman is not easy to write. You know, it's not believable. It was very difficult. Glynis John was in it, the little blonde. That was